My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, raised her glass at my 68th birthday dinner and told the whole table, smiling, that we should enjoy what's left of me now, since there wouldn't be much to leave anyone anyway. Nobody laughed harder than she did. My son said nothing. I said nothing back, not that night. Nearly a year later, Vanessa called me, her voice tighter than I'd ever heard it in 15 years of family dinners, and asked me to undo something I had already put into motion. $340,000, every dollar I had left to give, had just left my name. She hadn't heard it from me. She'd heard it from a letter. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, I am 68 years old. And this is the story of how a joke about everything I supposedly had nothing to leave turned into the one thing my daughter-in-law would spend the weeks that followed trying to take back. If you're watching this from your own kitchen table tonight, tell me where you're joining from, and whether you've ever had a family member decide out loud in front of everyone what your life was worth. I'd like to know I'm not the only one. The birthday dinner was at my son Grant's house, 11 of us around a table built for 8. My granddaughter Sophie squeezed in beside me the way she always does. Vanessa had made the cake herself. Lemon, my favorite, remembered without being told. That's the maddening part about Vanessa. She is capable of real thoughtfulness right up until the moment she isn't. The table was set the way Vanessa always sets a table when other people are watching. Cloth napkins folded into fans. Place cards in her careful handwriting even though we'd all sat in the same seats for years. I remember being glad of the effort walking in. I wasn't looking for anything to go wrong. The toast started warm enough. Grant said something about how lucky they were to have me, and I believed him because I think he meant it. Then Vanessa lifted her own glass, still smiling, and said, "And we just want Grandma to enjoy what's left, since there won't be much to leave anyone anyway," and laughed like it was an affectionate little joke about my modest retirement account, the kind of thing you're supposed to laugh along with. A few people did laugh. Not unkindly, I don't think, more out of reflex, the way a room laughs when someone laughs first. My cousin Ted chuckled into his wine. Sophie, at 9 years old, didn't laugh at all. She just looked at me, checking my face the way children do when they're not sure if something was actually funny. Grant didn't say anything. He looked down at his plate for exactly as long as it took the moment to pass, and then he asked someone to pass the potatoes. I said nothing either. I have a good poker face and I used it that night. I finished my cake, thanked Vanessa for remembering it was lemon, hugged everyone goodbye at the door, including her, and drove home alone in the dark with both hands steady on the wheel. Its own kind of answer if you know me well enough to notice. I didn't cry when I got home. What I did instead was go into the small back room I still call my office, even though I haven't worked in 6 years, and pull a folder out of a drawer I hadn't opened in nearly a year. I sat with it at my kitchen table until almost midnight, not making any decisions yet, just remembering that the folder existed, and that whatever I decided to do about tonight, I wasn't starting from nothing. 10 weeks passed before the second one, and in some ways those 10 weeks mattered more than the dinner itself, because I spent them noticing things I might otherwise have let slide. The way Vanessa referred to my house as a lot of space for one person twice at 2 different gatherings, the way she asked Grant within my hearing whether I'd made any plans yet, phrased exactly like a question about paperwork and not at all like a question about me. Thanksgiving was at my house that year, which made what happened harder to shrug off. I was in the kitchen checking the turkey when I heard Vanessa in the next room, talking to my cousin Ted's wife, not realizing how clearly sound carries through my open kitchen doorway. "Someone should really talk to her about a living trust," she said, not laughing this time, not performing anything for an audience. "I mean, she'll die alone eventually, and there's nothing to plan for anyway." Nearly the same sentence as the birthday toast. Not a joke this time, just an opinion spoken plainly to someone else the way you'd mention the weather. I stood at my own stove for a moment, oven door still open, and counted backward from 10 before I picked the turkey up, the way I used to tell my students to do before they said something in anger they couldn't take back. It wasn't the hot kind of angry. It was closer to a door quietly closing somewhere inside me. Not slammed, just closed firmly, the way you close a door you don't intend to open again. My sister Joyce was standing close enough in the hallway to hear it too, and when I came out of the kitchen with the turkey, her face told me I hadn't imagined the first one back in the summer. We didn't discuss it in front of anyone. We got through the meal. But in my kitchen afterward, drying dishes while everyone else watched football, Joyce set down the towel and asked me straight out, "How long are you going to let her get away with that?" "I'm not letting her get away with anything," I told her. "I'm just not finished yet." Joyce has known me for 63 years. She didn't ask what I meant by that. She just nodded once and went back to drying the good china, the way you'd nod at someone you trust to know what they're doing. Grant called me 2 days after Thanksgiving, and I remember hoping he was calling about what his wife had said. He wasn't, not directly. He asked if I was doing okay, the kind of question Grant asks when he already suspects the answer is complicated but would rather not find out how. I told him I was fine. He said Vanessa didn't mean anything by it, she just says things without thinking them through. And I let him have that version because he needed to believe it more than I needed to correct him. "She loves you, Mom," he said toward the end of the call a little too quickly. The way people say things they're hoping will make a conversation end sooner. "I know she does in her way," I told him, and I meant that too, which is one of the more uncomfortable truths in this whole story. That cruelty and affection can live in the same person without ever quite canceling each other out. I didn't tell him about the folder. I didn't tell him I'd already started making calls. That wasn't going to be his to carry, not yet, and maybe not ever, depending on how things went. If a family member has ever decided out loud what you're worth, and you believe quiet dignity beats a shouting match, subscribe. What comes next in this story is exactly that. It isn't about getting even. It's about a decision I'd actually been building toward for a long time, long before anyone at that table ever opened their mouth. Here's what almost none of my family knows about me. Not a secret, just a thing nobody ever thought to ask. For over 20 years, I volunteered at Willow House, a women's shelter across town. Most weeks doing intake paperwork or sitting with women on their first frightened night there. In 2014, when a funding shortfall nearly closed the place for good, I was one of 3 board members who spent 4 months finding the donors and grant extensions that kept its doors open. I have a photograph from that year, a little yellowed now, of 6 of us standing in front of the building the week we secured the funding. It's in the same folder I pulled out the night of the birthday dinner. I don't think Vanessa has ever heard the words Willow House in her life. I don't think that's an accident. I never advertised it because it was never done to be seen. I called my attorney, Angela Reyes, the Monday after Thanksgiving. Angela has handled my affairs for almost 15 years, since not long after Frank died. And when I told her I wanted to talk about finishing what I'd started, she didn't ask me to clarify. She already had a fair idea what I meant because I'd mentioned Willow House to her more than once over the years in the vague, someday maybe way people talk about things they haven't fully committed to yet. We met in her office the following week. She laid out the options plainly, the way she always does. I could simply update my will to name Willow House as a beneficiary, straightforward and revocable, the kind of thing that can quietly be changed again in 5 years if I felt like it. Or I could formalize a donor-advised fund now, while I was alive, to see it matter, structured and funded immediately rather than promise for later. I already knew which one I wanted. A will is a plan for after you're gone. I wanted something that existed now, today, while I could still watch what it did. Most people your age go the other direction, Angela said, not unkindly, more observational than anything. They wait. They want the leverage of an undecided will hanging over the family a while longer. I've had plenty of leverage for plenty of years, I told her. I'd like to try something else for once. She smiled at that, the closest thing to approval I'd gotten from anyone about any of this so far, and made a note on her legal pad. There's also the question of size, Angela said, sliding a legal pad across the desk. Are we talking about a portion of the estate, or all of it? I told her the number I'd been circling in my head since the night of the birthday dinner. $340,000. The proceeds from selling the house once I downsized. My retirement account, which I no longer needed at the size it had grown to, not with my pension and Social Security covering what I actually spend in a month. A small stock portfolio Frank had left me that I'd never touched. All of it redirected, while keeping enough set aside for a modest condo and a comfortable, unremarkable life. That's the whole surplus, Angela said. You understand that? I told her I understood it completely. I wasn't leaving myself with nothing. I was leaving myself with exactly enough, which is a different thing, and a thing I'd thought about far more carefully than one dinner table joke could account for. Angela drafted the agreement over the following 2 weeks. Willow House named sole beneficiary of a formal donor-advised fund, assets to be transferred and irrevocably committed within the quarter. I read every page, asked questions about vesting, about what irrevocable actually meant in practice, because I wanted to understand exactly what I was locking myself into first. At our second meeting, Angela asked the question I'd been waiting for, the one that mattered more to me than almost any other clause in the document. Do you want this gift to carry your name? She asked. Or would you prefer it stay anonymous? Some donors prefer privacy. Neither, I said. I want it to carry someone else's. Angela looked up from the legal pad. I don't think in 15 years I'd ever surprised her before. I explained it to her plainly without raising my voice, because I'd had weeks by then to sit with the reasoning, and it no longer felt like anger when I said it out loud. It felt more like arithmetic. If my daughter-in-law wanted to talk about what I had left to give, I decided, I would rather the answer be permanent and public and true. And I would rather her own name be the one attached to it, whether she ever wanted it there or not. In honor of Vanessa Hartwell, I told Angela. That's what I wanted the dedication to read. Angela didn't ask me to reconsider. She wrote it down. Then she told me something I hadn't fully thought through. That once the transfer completed, Willow House's donor system generated an acknowledgement letter automatically, mailed to the honoree's address on file, the same address Vanessa had given the shelter years earlier, the one time she dropped off a box of donated coats. That letter would go out on its own timeline, addressed to the Hartwell house, with no message from me required. I told Joyce the whole plan that weekend, sitting at her kitchen table, and I watched her face go through 3 or 4 different expressions before she settled on one. First something like shock when I said the total figure. Then something sharper when I told her whose name was going on the dedication. Then, finally, something I can only describe as fierce pride, the kind Joyce reserves for very few things. You are a genuinely frightening woman, Eleanor, she said, and I could hear her smiling when she said it. I learned it from surviving 50 years of family dinners, I told her. You'd be frightening too eventually. I mean that with love, Joyce said. But God help that girl. I asked her not to say anything to anyone, not yet, not until the letter did whatever it was going to do on its own. Joyce agreed, though she made me promise to tell her the second anything happened, and I promised because keeping Joyce out of the loop has never once worked out well for me in 63 years of trying. What I didn't know yet was that Grant had already started asking his own questions. He called Angela's office directly that same week, not to accuse anyone of anything, he told me much later, but because something about my mood since the holidays had unsettled him enough that he wanted to understand it. He even asked her carefully whether there was a normal process if a family had concerns about an aging parent's judgment, a question Angela recognized immediately as the opening move toward a formal capacity evaluation, the kind of thing that can freeze an estate plan in place for months while lawyers argue over it, whether or not the parent in question is perfectly clear-headed. She told him only what she was allowed to tell anyone, that client matters were confidential, and that if he had concerns about his mother, he should raise them with his mother directly, not with a capacity claim. He didn't call me. He told me afterward that her refusal to say anything at all had somehow worried him more than if she'd told him something small and reassuring, and that he sat with that unease for weeks without mentioning it to Vanessa or to me. I didn't find out how close he'd come to that particular door until long after it was already shut. I want to be honest with you here about something. This wasn't the moment I felt triumphant. It was quieter than that. More like setting down something heavy I'd been carrying since summer, and trusting the paperwork to finish carrying it from here. I believe the truth eventually finds its own way to the people who need to hear it, even when nobody delivers it directly, and that's exactly what the rest of this story is building toward. Life didn't stop for any of this, of course. There was a smaller family lunch in January, just the 5 of us, and Vanessa tried once more carefully this time, testing the water rather than performing for a crowd. "I just worry about you being alone in that big house, Ellie," she said, over sandwiches. "Have you thought about what happens to it?" Something in my face must have shifted, some small thing I couldn't fully control, because for the first time I watched Grant change the subject before I had to answer, asking Sophie about her science fair project, loudly enough to redirect the whole table. It wasn't him standing up for me exactly. It was the first crack I'd seen in his silence, and I noticed it the way you notice the first warm day after a long winter, cautiously, not trusting it yet. "I have thought about it," I told Vanessa evenly. "More than you'd guess." She laughed, the same easy laugh from the birthday toast, and said something about being just practical. I let it go. I didn't correct her. There would be time for the truth to correct her instead. Grant called me that same week alone without Vanessa in the room. I could tell by how quietly he was talking. "You seem different at lunch," he said. "Is everything okay with the house?" "With money." I told him everything was fine, better than fine actually, which was true in a way he couldn't have understood yet. He didn't push. I think some part of him didn't want to know the answer badly enough to ask the real question underneath it. And I let him have that too, the same way I'd let him have it after Thanksgiving. Selling the house was the part one hadn't fully prepared for, even after months of preparing everything else. Frank and I bought it 31 years ago, and his workshop in the garage still had half-finished projects in it 6 years after he died, because I'd never had the heart to clear it out. Selling it wasn't just funding a gift. It was the last piece of him I had to let go of on purpose, on a schedule, instead of by accident the way grief usually takes things. Vanessa found out about the listing before I'd told her myself. A neighbor mentioned the sign to her at the grocery store, and she called me within the hour, her voice sharper than I'd heard it since Thanksgiving. "Are you actually selling the house? Why didn't anyone tell me?" I told her the part of the truth that was actually hers to know, that I was downsizing, that it was time, that a smaller place suited me better now. "Downsizing to what exactly?" she pressed. "Where's all that money going, Ellie?" It was the closest she ever came before the letter to asking me directly. I told her it was going somewhere sensible, and that she'd understand everything in time. She didn't push further, but underneath the sharpness I could hear something that almost sounded like fear. Not for me, I think, but for herself, for what it might mean if I stopped needing anyone to manage things on my behalf. "I'm just being practical the way I always am." she said, quieter than I expected. And for the first time all year, the word didn't sound like an excuse. I don't want you making some huge decision alone, and then needing us and resenting that you didn't ask. It was, I'll admit, the most honest thing she'd said to me in over a year. It didn't undo the birthday toast or Thanksgiving, but it made her, for one phone call, a person instead of just an obstacle, and I've tried to hold on to that fairness even now telling this story. And she wasn't wrong, not about that part. I was moving $340,000 out of this family without one other person in it knowing the shape of the decision beforehand. A stranger looking in might have called that reckless, whatever my reasons were. I made the same choice anyway. I just stopped pretending after that call that she hadn't earned the right to ask. Sophie came to help me pack the garage on a Saturday in February, 9 years old and entirely too small to be useful. But she wanted to, and I have learned not to turn down a 9-year-old who wants to help. She found Frank's old toolbox at the bottom of a shelf, dented tin, his initials scratched into the lid in his own hand decades ago, and she held it up and asked if she could keep it. So some of Grandpa stays with us, she said. I said yes before she'd finished the sentence. That toolbox is on a shelf in her bedroom right now, and I think about it more than I think about almost anything else in this whole story, because it reminds me that whatever else was happening with the money, with Vanessa, with the paperwork, the actual center of my life was never any of that. It was a 9-year-old who wanted a piece of her grandfather to keep, and who I would have given the toolbox to regardless of what anyone had said at any dinner, ever. The sale nearly didn't happen on schedule at all. 3 weeks before closing, the buyer's financing fell through without warning, and for 4 days I genuinely didn't know whether I'd have a closing to sign that spring. Angela called it not unusual, but not nothing. Real estate language for a delay that could push everything past the fund's funding deadline and leave the whole plan sitting half-finished, exposed, exactly long enough for someone to ask the wrong question at the wrong dinner. I told Joyce the sale was moving along. It wasn't, not yet. A second buyer came through 4 days before the deadline. I try not to think about what I would have done if one hadn't. Joyce came over the night before the closing, and we sat in the empty living room on 2 folding chairs, the furniture already gone. 31 years of a life fit into boxes stacked against the wall. She asked, half joking, if I wanted to say anything to the house before I handed over the keys. What I said out loud was just, "Thank you for holding all of it." Frank would have laughed at me for talking to a house. I let myself do it anyway. The house closed in March. I signed the closing papers on a Tuesday and got Angela's confirmation email on a Thursday that the fund was fully and irrevocably funded. Every dollar of the $340,000 committed, no longer mine to reconsider even if I'd wanted to. 2 ordinary-looking documents, 3 days apart, and between them, the entire shape of my remaining life had changed. Joyce called 2 days after that with a different kind of warning. She'd heard from Grant, in an unguarded moment at her own kitchen table, that he'd called Angela's office back in December and hadn't liked how little Angela would tell him. "He's not going to let it go forever, Ellie," Joyce said. "He's your son. Eventually he adds it up." I told her it didn't matter now even if he did. The fund was already irrevocable, nothing left for anyone to stop. I don't think I fully exhaled until I heard myself say it out loud. I moved into the condo the following weekend, into a second bedroom smaller than any room I'd lived in since I was first married, and it should have felt like losing something. It didn't. I put Frank's old photo from the 2014 fundraiser on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where I'd see it every morning making coffee. It's still there now. Willow House's director, Marisol Vega, called me herself the following week. I could hear in her voice she'd read the paperwork twice before picking up the phone. $340,000 was the largest single gift the shelter had ever received, larger, she told me, almost apologetically, than its entire annual operating budget, which ran a little under $280,000 most years. I don't recognize the name on the dedication, Marisol said carefully. Vanessa Hartwell. Is she a board member I'm not aware of? She's my daughter-in-law, I said. She's not on your board. There was a pause on the line, the kind where I could tell Marisol was deciding whether to ask the obvious follow-up question. She didn't ask it directly. What she said instead was, "Can I ask what this is really about?" It's for someone who needed a reason to think about what she says. I told her. It was the truest short answer I had. That's either the kindest thing I've ever heard, or the most quietly ruthless, Marisol said, and I could hear that she genuinely wasn't sure which. It can be both, I told her. It usually is with family. Marisol didn't push further, but something in how she thanked me afterward felt different from a routine donor call. Felt honestly like being seen in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. 20 years of Tuesday afternoons at that shelter, and this was the first time anyone there had looked at the whole shape of it and said thank you for the entire thing, not just one more folded stack of intake paperwork. Marisol told me the acknowledgement letters went out automatically at year-end, addressed exactly as the fund agreement specified. I told her that was exactly what I wanted. I hung up the phone and, for the first time since the birthday dinner back in the summer, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything anymore. What I want to tell you about the 6 months that followed is that almost none of it was about Vanessa at all. I moved into a smaller condo 2 miles from Joyce's house that spring, close enough for Sunday dinners most weeks, Sophie joining us whenever Grant dropped her off. My Tuesday shifts at Willow House kept going. Marisol introduces me to new volunteers now as one of the reasons this place is still standing, which still catches me off guard every time. One Tuesday in June, a woman named Deb, 2 nights into staying there with her kids, asked how long I'd been doing this. 20 years and change, I told her, and watched the number land as proof the place wasn't going anywhere. I didn't mention the fund or Vanessa. That wasn't what the conversation needed. I want to be plain about something because it matters more than the reveal that's coming. I wasn't spending those 6 months waiting for a letter to land at the Hartwell house. I built a life in that stretch of time that had nothing to do with whether Vanessa ever found out anything. Smaller, quieter, genuinely mine in a way the old house hadn't quite been in years. If the letter had gotten lost in the mail, I believe I'd still count those 6 months among the best of my life since Frank died. One evening that July, Sophie asked why I'd moved somewhere smaller. I told her most of the truth, that I didn't need the room, and I'd rather the extra go somewhere useful. She considered that with total 9-year-old seriousness and said, "That's a very grown-up thing to do." I told her I was working on it, but the letter didn't get lost. It arrived in early autumn in a plain Willow House envelope at the Hartwell family's front door, addressed the way the shelter system addresses every year-end acknowledgement, automatically, formally, on its own schedule, exactly as Angela had told me it would almost a year earlier. Vanessa told Grant later that she almost threw it away without opening it, assuming it was a solicitation. She opened it instead, standing at the kitchen counter, and read a single paragraph confirming that a gift of $340,000 had been made to Willow House, a women's shelter, in honor of Vanessa Hartwell, in recognition of her role in supporting the shelter's mission. Sophie was at the kitchen table doing homework when it happened, close enough to notice her mother go very still. She told me about it herself weeks later in the careful, slightly proud way children describe adult moments they weren't sure they were supposed to witness, that her mom's face did the thing it does when she's trying not to look upset in front of people, and that her dad read the letter twice before saying anything at all. Grant read it over her shoulder. His first thought, he told me afterward, was simple confusion. Vanessa had never once mentioned Willow House to him, never volunteered there, never given the place a second's thought beyond a box of coats years earlier. His second thought arrived almost immediately behind the first, the way understanding does when you've been half expecting it without letting yourself know that yet. "Mom set this up because of what you said at her birthday, didn't she?" he asked her. Vanessa didn't answer him. Grant told me later that the silence answered for her, more completely than anything she could have said. He sat with that silence for a long moment, turning the letter over in his hands. What he felt, he said, wasn't anger at his wife, not at first. It was something closer to embarrassment on my behalf, for having had to build something this elaborate just to be heard. I told him he didn't need to feel embarrassed for me. I'd built it because it was the version of being heard that actually worked, not because it was the only one I wanted. She called me that same evening, her voice tight in a way I genuinely never heard from her before, not once in 15 years of family dinners. "You didn't have to make it about me," she said, and I noticed even then that it wasn't quite an apology. It was closer to a complaint. I asked her gently which part she meant, the joke at my birthday, or the one at Thanksgiving that she hadn't realized I'd overheard at all. She went quiet for a moment. I let sit exactly as long as it needed to. She tried, over the following days, to get ahead of it a different way, calling Marisol Vega directly, asking whether the dedication could be changed, made anonymous, or removed from the shelter's records, framing it as a privacy concern rather than what it actually was. Marisol called me afterward, not for permission, the fund was already binding, already irrevocable, but to let me know the conversation had happened, and that she'd told Vanessa, politely and precisely, that a completed charitable gift isn't something the honoree gets to revise after the fact. She asked me twice, Marisol told me, whether there was any way to make it less public. I told her the fund is a matter of record the moment it's filed. I don't think that was the answer she wanted. "It's usually not," I said. "For what it's worth," Marisol added, "I didn't tell her anything about you. She didn't ask much about you at all, actually. Mostly about the paperwork." That detail sat with me longer than almost anything else in this story. Given the chance to ask a stranger about the mother-in-law she'd spent a year underestimating, Vanessa's first instinct was still to ask about the filing, not the person. 3 days after that call, Vanessa left me a voicemail. I still have it. In it, she's sorry if I felt hurt by anything she'd said, and then almost in the same breath that she just doesn't want people thinking I'm a bad person, as if the better part of a year had been building toward her own reputation, not toward anything she'd actually said to me twice in front of witnesses. I didn't call her back that night. I sat with the voicemail for a day, the way I'd sat with the folder back in the summer, before I decided what I actually wanted to say to her. When I did call, I kept it short. I told her the gift wasn't going anywhere, and I wasn't looking for an apology built around how the situation made her look. If she ever wanted to actually earn the honor her name was now attached to, Willow House takes volunteers on Tuesdays. I don't know if she'll ever show up. That was never really the point. "The gift isn't going anywhere," I said. "Neither am I." Then I ended the call, and for the first time in this entire story, I didn't sit afterward wondering if I'd said the right thing. I already knew I had. Grant came to see me alone the following weekend without Vanessa, something he'd almost never done in 11 years of marriage. We sat on my new, smaller porch, and he told me a little haltingly that he didn't think he'd ever really seen me. Not the Willow House years, not any of it, until this year forced him to look. I told him I hadn't exactly made it easy to see. That was truer than I let on. I could have told him everything back in November. The day he called sounding so unsettled, I nearly gave in right there on the phone. I chose the folder and the fund and the better part of a year of silence instead, because some part of me wanted the proof to speak for itself rather than my own voice one more time. Grant spent a whole winter worried about a mother who wouldn't say what was wrong. That worry was mine to own, not just Vanessa's. We left it there on the porch. Felt like enough for one visit. Sophie still has the toolbox on her bookshelf. She asked me recently whether Grandpa would have liked Willow House. I told her he'd have loved it, and that he'd have been proud of what his half of that money ended up doing, even without his name on any of it. She asked, a little shyly, if she was old enough to come with me on a Tuesday, just to see it. I told her 9 is young for the shelter floor, but Marisol always needs help sorting donations on Saturdays, and I'd take her the next one if her parents said yes. Grant said yes before Vanessa had finished asking what Willow House even was again. I noticed that and let it go the same as I'd let so many other things go this year. Except this time it felt less like restraint and more like simply not needing the last word anymore. My volunteer badge from Willow House still hangs by my front door. The old one, laminate gone soft and yellowed at the corners after 20 years, hanging right next to this year's fresh one with this year's date on it. I look at both of them most mornings on my way out, and some mornings I think about how close I came to letting one birthday toast decide for me what the last chapter of my life was supposed to look like. It didn't decide anything. If anything, it clarified something I'd been circling for years without quite finishing, that the life I actually wanted wasn't going to be won back from anyone at that table. It was just going to be built quietly on its own terms, whether or not the people who doubted me ever noticed in time. She said there wouldn't be much left to leave anyone. There was plenty left. It just never needed my name on it. If tonight's story reminded you that quiet and generous isn't the same as foolish, I'll admit I still go back and forth on one thing. Whether I owed Vanessa a single honest conversation before any of this started, or whether that long silence was simply the version of honesty I was capable of. Tell me in the comments whether you think I was fair to her, or took it further than I needed to. And if you believe the truth eventually finds its own way home, even when nobody delivers it directly, subscribe, because the next story is about a woman who waited even longer than I did, and found out even more because of it.